Yes, thank you very much. You're right, thanks to you that I learned that Roxanne is the most popular TV series right now. But unfortunately, I haven't included this series much in my presentation because my focus will be more on cinematic films, films which are screened on movie theaters. But I think in the end we will come and discuss Roxanne at some point. So thank you very much, first of all, for having me. And so my topic today has sort of different, let's say, chapters. Firstly, I want to talk about some of the basic concepts regarding memory, history, and film. And then I want to talk about some historical films, particularly about 1960s and 70s in Turkish cinema. And then the second part, I'm going to move to the recent recent decade in 2000 and the revival of history and memory in Turkish cinema. And finally, I would like to discuss films particularly focusing on the Ottoman past, which includes this TV series. So, yes, maybe we can, I think let me see, it doesn't work, maybe you can you? So I'll just probably start with some terms which I'll be using with this presentation. First of all, I think starting in the 1980s, memory has become a significant topic across diverse humanities and social science disciplines. And by 1990s, I think it was quite apparent that the technologies of globalism has affected the public discourse on memory. And thanks to this sort of development, probably in the recent times, we're witnessing what we might call probably a memory boom. And so this obsession with memory has had a particular impact on the production and reception of films, as well as the studies on films that are treating memory. So this rapidly growing phenomenon of memory studies, I think, might be related with a couple of things. Mainly, it is much largely indebted to studies on Holocaust, probably, on one hand, and it's also related probably with this sort of emergent discourse of national identity and memory in postmodern and postcolonial studies. We might talk about them later. And one of the terms which is used frequently, and I think it's sort of the pioneer of this field, is Maurice Halbwachs and his book called Collective Memory, which was published in French in 1950s, but was translated into English in 1990s. So it was in 1990s, I think, the Anglo-Saxon literature was introduced this term. Basically, the idea of collective memory is memory is something which is shared by a unit larger than the individuals. And this sort of Durkheimian, perhaps, approach is see memory and serves to present the goals of the society, such as maintaining and strengthening the group membership in some ways. So it's also used sometimes interchangeably with terms like cultural memory, social memory as well. What I think is interesting with this term, it's not that much fashionable these days, but I think what's important is that it's kind of useful probably is discussing how film or artwork as sort of can form a basis for common identity, a sense of community, and especially continuity of the past into the present. So another, perhaps, if you can move, sort of interchangeable term is this sort of distinction between history and memory. And in this sort of distinction, we sort of presume history has a recourse to the notions of objectivity, as opposed to memory, which is perceived as more unpredictable, sometimes colored with subjective response and amnesia in a way. So there's this, but I think this distinction again itself is not very clear-cut, and it's not sort of, let's say, black and white, as we will see in the examples. And another thinker, Pierre Nora, who has this sort of Spaces of Memory, another book, says that there's this transformation of memory, which is a shift from historical to psychological, from the social to individual, and from concrete to subjective. So it's kind of we have this witnessing, this sort of, hence the use of term memory is kind of related with that. Another term we use more as well is called the prosthetic memory, and this is a term introduced by Alison Landsberg, and it's used to describe the process where reconstructions of the past produce replacement memories that are simulating the first-hand experience. And this again has pros and cons, and there's this sort of pessimistic view with regard to prosthetic memory, which assumes that the images and stories of the past fed to us by global media networks produce false memories with this sort of prosthetic memory. So, and they have no relation to real and truth, and it's kind of impossible to determine. But on the other hand, Alison Landsberg claims the opposite, saying that it can be sometimes a positive thing, this prosthetic memory. It might sort of encourage people to explore or interrogate the limits of their engagement with history. So she has a more sort of, let's say, optimistic view. And sort of the final, perhaps, term which we will be using again is the trauma studies, so-called, which is also another sort of broad field. Just briefly, I'm going to talk about, actually it sort of again grows out of, let's say, on one hand Holocaust studies, and on the other hand sort of the definitions of American Psychiatrical Association, like post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. And basically the idea is that it's a kind of a revision of this Freudian and Lacanian sort of theory, which claims that there is this sort of unconscious and the, let's say, the repression of the unconsciousness, and that there is a surface consciousness. So in order to cure the trauma or come face to face with trauma, the psychiatrist or psychoanalysis role is to revive what has been repressed and, you know, to deal with it. But the trauma theory is saying that it is not a single, let's say, traumatic moment that causes this experience. It is a sort of layers of different experiences throughout the lifespan of a human being. And hence, you cannot clearly take out one repressed moment and to deal with trauma. So it's a kind of a combination of many layers. And so trauma theory and trauma studies is more interested in history, fantasy, and how sort of let's say repressive forgetfulness cause these traumas. So maybe we can come back to this term, but maybe one more thing before I move to my presentation is that this idea of unrepresentability or difficulty of representation in relation to trauma. And that might be, I think, best sort of exemplified in the famous dictum of Theodor Adorno. It's a sort of, this is the sort of a short version of poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. I think the longer version is a bit more sort of complex. But the idea is that, you know, in the face of a big traumatic event, it is almost impossible to recreate or represent that event. That is quite understandable, but I think what is problematic here, particularly in relation to trauma studies, is that other than the impossibility, it sort of causes a sort of a prohibition or interdiction against representation of trauma. How does it work? you know, on one hand, there are sort of different reactions. If you look at the art world, for example, after the Second World War, what we have, particularly in you know, plastic art, is kind of a, you know, abstract sort of painting, which is sort of non-figurative, non-representable, perhaps. This is a, maybe we can interpret as a kind of a reaction to the sort of unrepresentability of trauma, in a way. And the cinematic equivalent would be probably, you know, films on memory. On one hand, films like Hiroshima, Mon Amour, which sort of has this complex layers. And on the other hand, the postmodern reaction, let's say, with this provision is what we witness with Tarantino's film, like Inglourious Basterds, which basically can be argued that, you know, if such trauma is not easily represented, well, we can just sort of, you know, have this sort of ironic postmodern gameplay and, you know, change the historical facts and, you know, see what happens. Okay, so these are some of the, I think, sort of theoretical background of my study. Sometimes I will be using these terms interchangeably, but I think in the long run, at the end, we can sort of try to find out, you know, the links between them. So now I want to move to a particular case of Turkey. It's a sort of, I think, a very common phenomena all around the world, not just specific to Turkey. What we witness is that, you know, there's a sort of modernist, let's say, approach to memory and history, and it's a sort of a progressive approach which sort of tries to cut the links with the past, so that people can aspire for the sort of the future and scientific and technological development. And in order to achieve that, there is a sort of disattachment with the past. So that's something universal, which we're also discussing today. But I think Turkish has also some peculiarities, and particularly in relation to what I would call some sort of administrative forgetting. I mean, meaning that the state has some sort of regulations in order to erase the Ottoman legacy, which was a 600 sort of rule. And in order to do that, they had sort of, on one hand, the idea was to establishing closer ties with Europe, but on the other hand, it was, you know, the idea was to sever the ties with the Ottoman past. So what are these sort of, you know, moves to detach the Turkish history with the Ottoman past? Is that, you know, there is this, for example, some reforms regarding the costume of people, particularly the provision of the traditional fez and replacing it with the European Western style hats with brims. And then there was the regulation of time, which sort of included the adoption of Western clock and calendar. And then there was the more important, the script has been changed in 1928. And then there was the language reform, which sort of promoted the use of pure Turkish words, etc., etc. You know, these are some of the basics. So that even if you look at the history books at the time, there is almost no mention of the Ottoman history, and there is sort of a, let's say, creating a new historic identity in relation to Ottoman past, which is sort of with a relation with Turkic, let's say, tribes in Central Asia. And then, so this started changing in later in 1950, when Democratic Party was elected, and it sort of ended the single party rule in Turkey in 1950. And they were coming from a similar background, modernist background, but they were sort of more, let's say, conservative and pro-Islamic. Hence, things has started changing, and it was a time when the Ottoman history was included once again in the history book. And a significant, I think, point in that history was 1950 1953, which was the 500th anniversary of what is so-called the conquest of Istanbul by Turks. And that was the first time it was celebrated with a big event, which is still a major historical date in Turkish history, but that kind of started the shift. So let's have a look at the number of films. Suddenly you see a kind of increase. It's also the starting of the movie industry. I mean, in 1948 there was a tax reduction favoring Turkish films, and that's how the Turkish film industry started producing more films. And suddenly you have 5-10 films, and then reaching to up to 300 films in the 1970s, and this is the increase. And if you look at the number of what we might call historical films, there is a kind of I mean, there are interesting periods, let's say. And if you look closer to these periods, another sort of way to see it is probably if we see it as the percentage of the total number of films. And you can see, starting in 1950, there is a major increase. Suddenly you have, you know, 3 or 4 films, but compared to the films produced, which was like 10 in 1 year, it's a significant number. You see a lot of historical films, which sort of diminishes until the end of 1950s, and starting with 1960s, mid-1960s again. These were the times where there is sort of controversial times where, you know, there was sometimes conflicts or not wars, but let's say some conflicts. For example, in mid-1960s it was the conflict between Turkey and Greece, which sort of, I think, motivated filmmakers to make more historical films again. So you will see those different periods. So if you look at the, let's say, the themes or periods which these, it's kind of difficult to identify. Of course, we're talking about a large number. So the costume drama includes, it's a varied sort of category. It includes films relating with the Ottoman past mostly, and it's sort of sometimes focused on different periods. The most significant periods probably would be 15th and 16th centuries, where the empire was powerful. And it also includes some sort of references to sort of, again, pre-Ottoman Turkish sort of, for example, the Hunnic Empire and things like that was also, let's say, considered as Turkey. And sorry, we can go back. Independence War is the Turkish Independence War, which comes after World War I, between 1920 and 1923. And the Korean one, it's interesting, Turkey, so in order to be part of NATO, sent soldiers to Korea between 1950 and 53, and that was also another significant moment in the history. And the Cyprus issue, it was a divided island. I mean, it was a united island, first of all, until Turkey occupied it in 1974. But since 1960s, there was lots of conflicts in the island. So that's again another significant point. And social bandits are these sort of irregular military forces who are participating in the independence war, but I sort of counted as them a separate genre, apart from the independence war films. And then we have the sort of the fairy tale atmosphere, which again is set in the past. And then finally there's some religious films. And if you look at, again, the eras, it's a bit complex, but you can see that the most popular, again, is costume drama. But if you look at the Korean War, this is this line between 1950 and 1953, and then it disappears. And maybe another significant one is probably Cyprus, where you can see it increasing in certain moments, 1960s and again 1970s. And it shows you, when there's a conflict, there is a certain rise in the number of films that are dealing with history and with particular themes. Okay. So let's keep this in mind, and I'm going to move a bit fastly because of time constraint. So, and I would say that in 1970s, my I didn't much make calculations for mid-1970s because it was a different period. It was the crisis of Turkish cinema because of the introduction of television and instability of the political situation. The number of films produced were decreasing, and the crisis was lasted until mid-1990s. So that between mid-1970s and 1990s, you can see there's sort of a crisis of cinema in Turkey. And suddenly in 2000, we still, back again, we have this sort of return of these themes, memory and history. And if we sort of consider the 20th century as an age of forgetting for Turkish citizens, perhaps the turn of the century, 21st century, is the one of nostalgia. It's a sort of a new era. And so what we see in this period is, a sort of a large group of people are yearning for a sort of imagined past, and they're sort of interrogating and researching the questions of identity. So again, if I look at this period between this time, 2005 and 2013, it's not a significant number. If you look at, each year there were around 6 to 8 historical films. In total, there were 44 films which are set in the past, and it's sort of almost like the 10% of the total production of the era. But some of them are very, very successful in terms of box office. So this number probably might be misleading. If you look at the box office figures, not all of them, but you would see that there is a sort of, again, a significant sort of portion of the films are historical films. What is perhaps interesting in this period is that, okay, we can have a look at this time. What were I checked, what were the most popular, let's say, topics or themes filmmakers focused on, and it was kind of different. In the period in 1970s, it was mostly the Ottoman past, which was sort of and the glories of the Ottoman past. But if you look at 1970, it's not only these glorious moments, but also traumatic events. Some important events are represented. So if you look at it, first of all, my first conclusion would be a large number of films are set in the recent past, particularly in the time of the Turkish Republic, from 1920s to 1980s. And sort of the most significant periods were, chronically is this, of course, 1915, 2015 would be anniversary of these events. And this is the sort of the battle, the Caucasus campaign, Turko-Russian war, and particularly one particular battle, which sort of Ottoman army lost thousands of people, not just because of the strength of the army, but because of the bad weather conditions. But it's a sort of a very traumatic, big disaster. There were 2 films about this event. Probably this year we will have more because it's the anniversary. And they all differ, so I'm not going to get into detail, but the first movie is, I would say, more nationalistic in discourse, stereotypical, and the second one is more like an anti-war film. But we might discuss this in questions. Another significant period is, of course, the Battle of Gallipoli, again in 1915. There were 3 films so far shot recently, and there's at least 3 more films coming up this year. So this is a very hot topic. Another interesting topic is the representation of the leader of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And that's an interesting topic again, because there was almost like a prohibition of representation of Atatürk. And there were not any films until 1980s. And in 1980s and 1990s, there were some television shows depicting Atatürk, but it was a very big heated discussion because, you know, people were discussing which actor could play Atatürk. He's such a great man, and, you know, no actor can. At one point they were discussing that it must be a Hollywood star to represent Atatürk, and then
to make it more authentic.
Yeah, more authentic, and also more, let's say, powerful. And but then in 2008 there was this film called Mustafa, and it called a lot of stir because it was a kind of a revisionist film, first time showing his human side, and even the name title of the film with his first name Mustafa is significant, but it was showing, you know, him as a lonely man, a chain smoker, you know, there was some sort of childhood memories that he was afraid of dark and things like that, and people were furious, you know, how can you show a historical legendary figure with his human side? So there, after that, there were some, let's say, contra films which sort of show the official history version of the events. So that's probably another important topic, and these other following films are kind of related with this. It sort of shows the secular sort of achievements of the Republic. The first one is related with a soldier killed by Muslim fundamentalists. The other one is about the this sort of village school for farmers, which was again closed by the conservative Democratic Party government later on. So it's kind of related with Atatürk's life. And then other topics, again, in terms of historical order, would be 1950s. This time, for its first time, was a topic. There are 3-4 films. They show different aspects of it, particularly the third one, is about the attacks on you know, Jews and Christians in Istanbul in 1955. There was this sort of provocation and maybe a planned sort of, let's say, attack against non-Muslim people. It was you know, many people, their shops were raided, many people were killed, and that's film is about that event. And so they're showing different aspects of 1950s. And then another significant genre, I would say, is the military coup in 1980, which lasted, there was the first elections in 1983, but still its effects lasted longer. And it's, you know, there's almost, since 1980s, there are around 40 films produced on that particular period, but it was still significant, and in the recent years, you had some films. And apart from these films, we have films not directly related with, let's say, recent or distant past, but films that are on memory and remembering. For example, there is the film by Yeşil Ustaoğlu, which the main character has this Alzheimer's disease, and you know, has difficulty in remembering her past, and it's, you know, it's all sort of metaphorically related with the problems, difficult times, traumas of the past. So this is, I think, another second, let's say, important, let's say, point of the 2000s. There is this sort of non-historical, but films which are dealing with memory. Okay, and of course the TV series. We mentioned Magnificent Century, but there are a number of others. By the way, it's very popular in Turkey as well. I think it's the last season this year. But apart from that, there were some other TV series, and even TV series sort of mocking. The one called Harem is a sort of a comedy TV series which sort of mocks Magnificent Century, and it sort of, you know, makes fun of this TV series. Okay, so, and then if you look at still you know, we see what is represented on screen, but I think it's also significant what is not represented on film. And there are still some traumatic events in Turkish history which is still, I would say, not represented in Turkish. Despite these changes, has not been represented in film. First one is, of course, the Armenian genocide. So far, there has been no films about this. There were some, let's say, metaphorical approaches, perhaps, not directly related with the genocide, but sort of dealing with the traumas of it. This year, there is a film which is being made in Turkey. Again, it's the 100th anniversary, but it's again probably would be, if not a denialist film, it will be something more, let's say, in the line with official history. But also, Turkish-German director Fatih Akın, his latest film is on genocide, and so it's not been released yet, but probably it will cause a lot of stir in Turkey, and it will be interesting to see the reactions against this film. Population exchange between Greece and Turkey was important because 2 million Orthodox people from Turkey, mainland Anatolia, moved to Greece, and in exchange for some thousands, I don't know, not that much, large number of Muslims coming to Anatolia. There's only one film so far on this topic, and of course there was what's called the wealth tax, against aiming against Jews and Christians, and which sort of again an important traumatic event. There is only one film regarding this event as well. So these are still some of the topics which are missing in the picture. So in sort of when we look at the 2000s, I think we see sort of two different, let's say, approaches or genres of film. On one hand, we might call what we might call the heroic epics, like films about the glorious past, mainly dealing with Ottoman Empire, which is still a popular genre, mainly in television, not maybe that much in cinema. And on the other hand, what we might call memory films or nostalgia films. So what are these films? I mean, again, if I were to refer to, there's this definition of nostalgia film by Frederick Jameson in his book on postmodernism, and he says that these films are not interested in you know, sort of a caricature of the past. It's sort of a it's not the actual events of the past they're trying to recreate, but the mood and feeling of the past from the perspective of today. So it's this kind of approach is also prevalent in these films. I'm not going to get too much into detail of these films, but one significant feature is this. These are films dealing with 1950s and 1980s, and mainly set in small town, and it's usually represented from the character of a child, from a child's perspective, and it sort of sees the past as a kind of an innocent, let's say, a golden age, where there wasn't much of a conflict, not much problems. There's sort of this nostalgic yearning of towards the past. So my main sort of topic would be films dealing with Ottoman past and what is called neo-Ottomanism these days in Turkey. It means a number of things. Firstly, it's a political discourse. It was introduced, I think, by the Minister of Culture, current Minister of Culture, to signify the sort of the revival of the glory of the Ottoman past and becoming a sort of what they call soft power in the world events. But there is another side to it, which is this sort of commodification of the past, with these TV series, films, the architecture projects. Now you have these housing projects in Turkey, which are titled as, you know, with reference to different periods in Ottoman history. You have these handicrafts. If you've been to Turkey, you will see lots of them. There's new designers. Even the Ottoman cuisine is sort of being revived, and there's this sort of nostalgia about Ottoman past. And I think instead of neo-Ottomanism, I prefer the term Ottomania, because neo-Ottomanism has a sort of connotation of political, you know, policy. But there is, I think, two sides to this sort of interest in Ottoman past. To identify these two different approaches, I would use a term which is introduced by Svetlana Boym in her book called The Future of Nostalgia. Basically, she identifies two different forms of nostalgia. One is restorative nostalgia, and the other one is reflexive nostalgia. So what's the difference between them? The restorative nostalgia is those, let's say, nationalistic attempts, in a way, and which are sort of not think themselves as nostalgia, but present themselves as truth or tradition. And they're trying to protect the absolute truth. And they have mainly two main plots, which is one is the return to the origins, authenticity, and the other is the conspiracy. I mean, which means the threats against the national identity, this sort of conspiracy. And so there is one larger group of films which might be called restorative nostalgia, and on the other hand we have films which might be called reflexive, in the sense that they are more ironical, they sort of celebrate multiculturalism, they sort of show the ambivalences of longing and belonging, and does not shy away from contradictions in a way, and question the sort of the formation of identity. So before I conclude, I will go to show, just a second, two examples. One is more of an example of a restorative nostalgia, and the second one is the example of reflective one. So first one is with restorative nostalgia, is a film called The Conquest 1453. It's a recent film from 2012. It was the biggest production of Turkish film history, $1 million project. It attracted over 6 million people to the movie theaters, and you know, it's a very successful film. This is the scene from the opening of the film, which I'm going to show, and it shows the emperor, not the scene, but the film is about the Emperor Mehmet II, who has sort of, you know, captured Istanbul, seized Istanbul in 1453. But the beginning scene, we see the prophet Muhammad is talking about his dream of seizing, capturing Istanbul. And of course, in a funny fashion, if you see the movie Message, again, you know, there's this provision of depicting the prophet. So we don't see him, but we see from his point of view, like in the movie Message. And so he tells his idea of, you know, how Istanbul is important for the Muslim world. And then after this first scene, we move to 15th century Alexandropolis, where the empire was based at the time. And this link between, you know, the Muslim city Istanbul, or the, let's say, Islamization of Istanbul, I think is quite relevant or important, and it is sort of related probably with the recent sort of ideas about Istanbul, formulating a sort of nostalgic discourse in political Islam, and these long-term urban renewal projects in Istanbul, and I think it's sort of related with those events. So let's have a quick look at this scene. So it's Medina, years 600.
بأحاديثكم هذه فتحتم لنا وللمسلمين طريق الجهاد.
This is the point of view of the Prophet, which we don't see.
إذني أبشر بحذر المسلمين جميعا.
Even in this scene, there's this historical authenticity. They're speaking in Arabic, but in other parts of the film, when the soldiers of Roman Empire are speaking, they're speaking Turkish. So that's sort of, you can find authenticity there, but here.
ماذا قال رسول الله يا أبي؟
قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لتفتحن القسطنطينية
The name of this time.
فلن أعمل أميرها ولن أعمل جيش ذلك الجيش.
Henüz 21 yaşındayken müjdelenen güzel kumandan olma şerefine nail olacak Mehmet'in doğduğu sene mucizelerle dolu pek çok şey olmuştu. Atlar çok sayıda ikiz doğurmuş, toprak bereketinden 4 kez ürün vermiş, ağaçlar meyvelerinden yerlere kadar eğilmişti. Aynı yıl Konstantiniye semalarında gündüz vakti görülen kuyruklu yıldızsa, o güne kadar aşılamayan surların yıkılacağının bir işareti olarak değerlendirilmiştir.
Okay, and my final example is a film from restorative nostalgia. The film English title is called Who Killed the Shadows? It's about these imaginary characters of the Turkish shadow play, Karagöz and Hacivat. There are many legends about them, of course, these characters, but the film sort of imagines them as 13th century figures who live in the, which is sort of the time of the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, and it's the reign of the first Ottoman ruler, Orhan. And of course, this time period is this, you don't see this sort of Islamic identity. And in contrast, Karagöz himself is sort of a pantheist, and he believes in the god of the sky. His mother is shamanistic. And it shows of this sort of, let's say, synchronicity between different religions at the time, which is interesting. So that's it.
Tanrı seni be.
Arkadaşım ekledi de arz etti midesini. Babanın adı ne?
Baba. Güzel dedik o. Göktenliğe kalmıştı.
He?
Öldü.
Ne iş tutarsın?
Göçerim. Arka tabi işlerim.
Temin işlersin.
Hı.
İyi, bak ta ileride bir silah var. Koş, hadi.
İyi.
Bana gözlü. Gel. Şimdi bizim tek yeri zorlama yoktu. Müslüman mısın sen?
Yok.
Bak, Müslüman ol da öyle gel. Fukarasın. Yani ver üstü az dur. Anladın mı? Hadi.
İyi.
Adın nedir? Filippo. Şahidin var mıdır?
Evet.
Benim söylediklerimi tekrar et. Eşhedü en la ilahe illallah ve eşhedü enne Muhammeden abduhu ve resuluhu.
Eşhedü en la ilahe illallah ve eşhedü enne Muhammeden abduhu ve resulü.
Şahit misiniz? Şahit misiniz? Allah kabul etsin. Sıradaki...
Conversion is made.
Din değiştirme mi? Sıra var baba, ne sıra? Ne acelesi var?
Din değiştirmek senin ne mi? Senin inancın yoktur.
Ben inancım var. Ben güya torpağa inanırım. Suya daha inanırım. Sema'yı değildir. Sayılmaz. Seni Ortodoks yapalım. Ortodoks.
Yoldan efendim! Biz bu cahil Türkmenlere gelirse buna kırarım bacaklarını. Hadi!
So I will conclude with this note, and maybe we can now discuss, Magnificent Century or other examples together. Thank you very much.
Так, ми маємо 15 хвилин на питання, а потім ми можемо після обіду ще продовжити дискусію. Я передаю слово львівському історику Василю Расевичу, і він спробує відмодерувати.
Так, тобто дуже дякую пану професору за дуже цікавий, концентрований такий аналіз, який ми побачили, почули і могли співпереживати. Дуже дякую також пану професору за теоретичний вступ, для того, щоб нагадати, з яким інструментарієм маємо тут справу. Дійсно, мені надзвичайно сподобалося те, як пан професор показав основні такі критичні точки турецької історії, як намагалися справлятися із своїми складними проблемами минулого турки за останні десятиліття, вказав на ті теми, які обов'язково далі залишаються табуїзованими. Але починаючи свій виступ, ви сказали про відтворення пам'яті. Ви вжили, можливо, це проблеми перекладу, але відтворення пам'яті. І потім далі говорили про конструювання пам'яті. Тому що насправді відтворювати пам'ять неможливо. Ми не були ніколи свідками того, що відбувалося колись давно і там, де ми просто не були. І це все ми маємо справу з таким конструюванням нашого минулого, і це всього-навсього наша рецепція цього минулого. Хотів би вас питати, чи є якісь внутрішньо турецькі місця пам'яті, це за Морісом Гальбаксом і П'єром Нора, які би працювали на творення якихось локальних ідентичностей в турецькій нації? Чи є такі антагоністичні між собою місця пам'яті? Чи є загальнотурецькі місця пам'яті, які можуть порятувати ситуацію і сприяють ідентичності турецької нації? Моє таке перше питання.
Okay, thank you very much. When you say antagonistic or negative landmarks, is it mean that the traumatic events, or which is sort of enemies, or I'm trying to figure out
Хотів би уточнити, в українському випадку, наприклад, є західноукраїнські місця пам'яті і є місця пам'яті радянських українців. Тобто ці місця пам'яті між собою не є не тільки узгодженими, вони належать до різних традицій, і вони дуже часто є антагоністичними через те, що, наприклад, радянська пропаганда зробила із тих борців за незалежність України, які боролися на заході України, вона зробила з них антигероїв. І це настільки закорінилося в пам'яті, наприклад, східних українців до сьогоднішнього дня, що деякі політологи чи там політичні технологи можуть дуже легко і успішно маніпулювати цими речами, протиставляючи пам'ять різних регіонів. А, наприклад, українська держава мало зусиль прикладає для примирення цих пам'ятей.
Okay, yes. In that sense, I think the biggest sort of controversy would be the landmarks of, let's say, Islamic religion and the national sort of landmarks which are introduced after 1920. For example, the festivities of Ramadan, Al-Eid, which are sort of in the Republican periods were not that much significant. There were sort of important Islamic days, which were not much. It was celebrated, but with, let's say, in a modest fashion. but in the last 10, 20 years, even the name of these festivities has been changed. It used to be called, for the L8, it was called the Candy Sweet Festival, because people, sort of distributed sweet to children. And then they changed it back to Ramadan holiday. So there's even this sort of, let's say, contestation between religious and national identity. So these are the two competing landmarks which I think still being debated, and even the names of it, and now even Turkey people claim different names for this festivity. And in relation to your second question about relations with Ukraine and representations of Ukraine, I believe until, thanks to this recent series, Roxalan has suddenly become an important figure, very popular figure, but her Ukrainian identity was not well known, was not mentioned in history, so there wasn't much of a, let's say, there was kind of a ignorance about Ukrainian, let's say, in relation to Ukraine. I can't think of any sort of particular historical point.
Хотів би тільки одне зробити уточнення і ще одне запитання, і тоді вже тоді передам мікрофон у зал для наступних запитань. Отже, моє перше уточнення хотів би від вас почути. Туреччина також, турецьке суспільство також має не подібну проблему, але трохи подібну проблему до української, тому що є курдська проблема. Тобто, як вмонтовується в цю історичну ідентичність, вмонтовуються курди, чи вони підлягають туркізації, чи вони просто замовчуються. Їхня присутність замовчується, викидається із історичного наративу, це перше. А друге, чи відчувається зараз, чи позначаються на виписуванні нового історичного наративу в Туреччині погляди політичні Реджепа Ердогана і його політичної партії, яка, як відомо, взяла курс на повернення певних ісламських елементів у турецьке суспільство, і тут виникає певний такий конфлікт. Тобто, чи це відчувається в кінематографії, чи відчувається це в історичних програмах на телебаченні?
Okay, first question, you're right, I haven't included let's say, Kurdish insurgents, and it's one of them, again, the most traumatic events of the recent past. Perhaps the reason I exclude is it was more recent event. The civil war started in mid-1980s and it continued until recently. But I would say it's, I think it's quite relevant to what I'm talking about. But I think, luckily, we have more, let's say, courageous and interesting and diverse representation of that trauma. And we have recently have films in Kurdish, which are dealing with this trauma. And so there again, actually there is very interesting, it must be a topic which could be considered on its own, perhaps, but there is very interesting narrative coming out of that trauma. There is this sort of, let's say, combination of documentary style, which is fused with fiction, filmmaking narrative, fiction narrative, and it's sort of they are presenting complex. Let me give you one example, perhaps a recent film. The character is herself is a sound recordist and recording songs of the Kurds, and there are many layers. And then there's sort of documentary let's say, shots in the film which are interviews with the victims of the people died in the Civil War, and there are sort of many layers in the film. So you're right, it's a very interesting sort of area, and there's a growing, let's say, genre of films about that. Regarding the last issue, I think what we might, the Roxelana example might be a good point in that sense. It's a very interesting, and a successful example in one sense. I think in one sense it's a sort of a revisionist text, because it was very much criticized, by the way, by conservatives and nationalists in Turkey, because it doesn't show the glorious sort of the warring sultan. Instead, it shows his private life, and even government tried to ban this series. So on one hand, it's kind of revisionist and let's say restorative, or in Svetlana Boymstorm. But on the other hand, it still shows this sort of this glory or magnificence, so-called, of the empire. And I think its success lies in this sort of combination, and probably that's why it sort of resonates in other countries as well. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to hear to your presentation, and thank you very much for all the reflections. But I was trying hard also to think about what actually will happen, because we all are trying to think about the memory boom, sometimes forgetting about the context of this memory boom. Professor Svetlana Boym, to whom you referred and quoted from her Nostalgia for the Future, is of the generation of the children, the Soviet children, which were actually raised in the boom of other kind of cinema, much of which was the science fiction cinema. And when I think what is the counterpart to this historical feature films, or films which sometimes pretend to blur the boundary between documentary and feature film, then I think about the missing part, and the missing part is this futuristic part. So how do you think, because now here in Ukraine we are hardly pushing ourselves to think backward and forward, what we actually have overlooked in the recent years, what the Russian cinema was in this very much restorative mood of the return of the Soviet, and probably even a return of the Soviet imperialistic discourse through the media, which was actually, the audience was not only internally Russian, but very much also projected to Belarus and Ukraine and probably Kazakhstan. I don't know how much Russian coverage and radio. Trying to think, how can you reflect on the contemporary Turkish historical drama? Is it part of the problem already, or is it part of the solution? Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for your comments. I need to think more about this science fiction, and it's a very interesting comment. I think you're right. I mean, the counter or alternative might be a vision of future, but that's which is lacking, interestingly, from Turkish cinema, and it's probably was kind of dominated or hijacked by Western sort of representations in a way. Maybe that might be one reason, but all sort of so-called science fiction movies are imitations of Western science fiction films. So that's one thing. In relation to what will come out of this, and then what's the situation? I tend to be optimistic in the sense that even these sort of minor revisionistic point of views in these popular TV series is a way of starting to interrogate and question, and imagining a different sort of past than which was introduced to us in history textbooks. So I believe that those are small steps, but important in a way. Even, until recently, it's a very minor fact, but many people presume that the wives of sultans, like Roxanne was, they were all Muslim, and and we see and we know that now, even after they converted, some of them, and also this includes the officials, they had their own religion, at least practicing their religion. So even those minor details probably would, I hope, sort of help people to imagine a sort of a different route alternative. But yes, this is something which has to be think carefully. Thank you.
Пан Теколос, і це
Дякую.
останнє запитання.
Дякую. Пане професоре, два короткі дуже запитання маю до вас. Отже, перше питання стосується фігури умовчання у історичній драмі турецькій. Ви наводили кілька тих топосів, які стосуються тих тем, які є табуйованими. Одним із цих табу є там турецько-грецькі стосунки, пов'язані з міжвоєнними депортаціями. Я, звичайно, не можу знати так глибоко турецький кінематограф, як ви, але пригадуються два фільми. Один з них, здається, «Дрібка спеції» називався в європейському прокаті, а другий «Народ мого діда», здається, Чаан Ермак, режисер. Отже, там є певне звернення до цієї теми, як ви його оцінюєте. І друге і останнє запитання – це, власне, питання, наскільки категорії історичної травми і ностальгії активно використовуються чи не використовуються у сучасному, так би мовити, анти-ердоганівському дискурсі. Ми знаємо про ту політичну опозицію, яка зараз є всередині Туреччини, до того неоосманізму. Чи такі Ердогана апелюють до категорії історичної пам'яті, травм і ностальгії? Дякую.
Very much for these films. Yes, you're right. That's the only film so far made on. And there is an American by Elia Kazan. America is also sort of slightly dealing with that issue. But yeah, that's an exception. The last issue I think interesting. Let's not just the Erdogan supporters, but let's say what's for Islamist part of the society. They, on one hand, they had their own, let's say, historical in the 1980s films about which, again, I forgot to mention this, dealing with the again the Republican period, 1930s and 40s, and how people were religious people, Muslim people were forced to change their identity. For example, there's two recent examples about this religious figure, Said Nursi, which has his own sect in Turkey, and the representation of him is that because of his ideas, he was forced to expelled and stuff like that. So there is this other genre, and their reaction to, let's say, more popular examples like